Tell me first of all about your latest book about euthanasia.
Well, it's another one of those hot potato issues we can't keep away from. Like so many of these topics, they keep raising their ugly head. Sadly, the other side seems to neither sleep nor eat. They're always active. They're always doing things.
Yeah.
And of course, the push for euthanasia has been ongoing. We've had numerous bills in the past. Over the last 20 years, the same with something like the homosexual marriage debate, on and on, another bill. They've all thankfully been defeated thus far, but once again, it's being pushed in my home state of Victoria. It was just knocked back recently in South Australia.
That's right.
So it's an ongoing fight, and therefore we need to have some information available. And there is, mind you, plenty of good stuff. America, England already has a lot of great resources. Not as much with the Australian data, the Australian facts, quotes from Australians and so on. So that's kind of what I've been doing, filling that gap between all the great material that's out there, but getting kind of the Australian context put in. So yeah, brand new book just out. Actually part of a series of books. This is the one on euthanasia that just appeared about a month ago. We did already one on abortion. And a third will complete the trilogy on IVF and surrogacy. So these are all kind of the main bioethics issues that are just bubbling along all the time. Sadly, the church is not always even aware that these discussions are being had, but certainly anywhere in the world, any newspaper you pick up, any current affairs show, these things are always the topic of discussion. So we need to be up on them. And as with all my books, I'll present half of the book, secular social science data and arguments, nothing biblical about it, just the arguments as they are. And then for those interested, there is a biblical theological component. So you can go both ways. You can give the book to your non-Christian friends, and they'll be of great value. And for those who are believers, a bit of each is hopefully of help.
So we've had over, I believe the number's over 30 attempts to legalise assisted killing of people in Australia. This is a national issue. As you said, recently defeated in South Australia, currently being pushed for in Victoria. There's quite a well-presented case for euthanasia. People argue that suffering is the core issue. And as Christians, as humans, everybody has a compassionate response to want to end suffering. We don't want people who have zero quality of life, immense amounts of suffering, and categorically zero hope for a positive outcome, likely to die in days, if not a small amount of weeks, to suffer needlessly. The argument is put, if it's kindness to put your much-loved pet dog out of its misery, why would you put your much more loved mother, wife, or child through that kind of suffering when you wouldn't inflict that on somebody else?
Yeah. Good
Start with perhaps how you answer that question. The question of suffering.
Well, straight away, I want to challenge even the way you even frame the discussion. I know where you're coming from, but you mentioned early on there's well-presented arguments for assisted suicide. I even wonder if they are, in fact. I mean, often it really is more of an emotional appeal. It's based on, personal stories, grief, hardship cases, extreme cases. And we don't discount them. They're part of the overall package of discussion. But often there is a lack of fact, evidence, data, and it is pushed on this level. Oh, the poor suffering soul. So, look, a couple of short things you would say about that. One, you'd simply say it's a funny way to deal with suffering by killing the sufferer. I mean, that's one way to do it, but it's an odd way to say, well, we do it with animals. Well, the simple truth is we're not animals. We are more than animals. We are made to have eternal existence, with dignity, with an importance of being that we don't predicate to the animal world. So therefore, if there's a lowering of the quality of life, if there's suffering and health issues, guess what? That doesn't diminish who we are as persons. That doesn't diminish our dignity, our importance as being human beings. So, well, that's really the nature of the beast, not just here, but with the abortion debate. What does it mean to be a person? Are we simply, is it a utilitarian kind of argument that if you're living a good, productive life, then there's life worthy of living? But if it's decreasing in quality, however we define that, and that's all very subjective, then do we become less persons? Do we become less worthy of human dignity and respect? So you really go back and challenge the very core presumptions of the other side, and once you start unpacking that, well, then it's not quite as straightforward. And by the way, if you're going to throw emotive stories around, well, do it the same. Let's give some emotive stories of those who are feeling the pressure to be knocked off, if we can put it that way. There's a lot of cases. We have plenty. In my book, I document them. Sadly, sometimes a loved one may not want a family member to keep living. There could be selfish reasons. Hey, there's a fortune awaiting me if I can just get her to go. In fact, in my book, I document government cases of this very thing. A long time ago, here in Australia, there's, it used to be called the Economic Planning and Advisory Council. They put out a series of research papers. So like over 20 years ago, they put out a booklet on euthanasia. Now, what are the standard arguments? Well, you kind of raise them. There's end-of-life decisions, great suffering, no hope of turning things around. So that's usually the pitch that's given. Did the EPAC study run with any of this? No. They simply said it's all in terms of economic cost and benefit.
Can you tell me what EPAC is?
Yeah, well, that was the Economic Planning and Advisory Council. And their consideration were purely economic. We know that end-of-life healthcare is your most expensive. You'll spend more money as you get elderly than probably the rest of your life. So fair enough, we have a lot of scarce resources. How much are you going to put into end-of-life healthcare? We have a shortage of hospital beds. I mean, all these kind of pragmatic considerations. Do we just keep a guy in a bed for a long time, or wouldn't it be nice to free up that bed and not spend so much money on looking after the elderly? So here was a whole case made, basically for euthanasia, purely in terms of economics. It makes economic sense to bump people off earlier because of scarce healthcare costs. So none of that so-called compassion was even there. But even if we play with that line, right, this compassion thing, well, again, compassion should not involve killing the sufferer. But again, a clarity and definition is needed. If a person is on the natural course of death, they're dying. Nobody in our side of the debate is saying they must be artificially kept alive. We must prolong and, try to insist they keep alive as long as they can. If you're on the natural course of death, you provide comfort, you provide nutrition, hydration. These are always the basics in healthcare. But nobody is saying let's artificially prop them up, have all kinds of machines, tubes running in them. So it's a misnomer to begin with, this idea that we're forcing people to stay alive or simply on the natural place of death. What the euthanasia debate very simply is, it's the deliberate taking of human life. Whether it's a gun to the head, a lethal injection, whether it's assisted by a doctor, whether you do it yourself, it's taking life when it's not yet time to go. So that's our main case. We're not about keeping people alive who are on the way to death. So that is compassion. You don't want to kill somebody prematurely for any number of reasons, but you're also not involved in all kinds of artificial means to prop up a life of somebody who is on the natural path to death. So even getting those definitions right helps in this debate.
Now, I've heard it argued by some of the advocates of assisted killing, assisted suicide, that opposition to assisted suicide is largely, if not exclusively, based in religious convictions. And they tend to then dismiss everything that follows.
Sure.
Now, the Australian Medical Association basically agrees with the position of preserving life, neither prolonging nor hastening death. They're against euthanasia. And I've also heard it put that the majority, I think they've actually articulated that the majority of medical associations, overwhelming majority of them around the world, actually take the position of being opposed to euthanasia.
That's right.
Now, I'm not under the impression that the Australian Medical Association is overly religious, nor most of them around the world. What kind of ethics and science and data are they basing their decisions on without any reference to moral obligations?
Well, this is a good point because it really runs with almost all of the hardcore debates we now have: homosexual marriage, abortion, euthanasia, and so on. Often our arguments are dismissed as just that, oh, it's religious. And in fact, they narrow it down. Oh, you're Roman Catholic, right? You're a bunch of Catholics. You're fixated on these things, and therefore we dismiss your arguments because clearly as a religious person, you have no right to speak, which is effectively how they run. But as you rightly said, first of all, there's plenty of secular groups who take the same line that we take on all these issues, on the importance of natural marriage, on the sanctity of life at both ends of the spectrum. Well, again, as I say in my book, each of these begin the first half totally secular arguments, secular data, secular evidence, the latest in medical, scientific journals, all that I quote, hundreds of footnotes. Nothing to do with religion, certainly nothing to do with Catholicism. And the arguments are there made. So as I say, if you give this book to your non-Christian friend, he doesn't like religion, you rip it in half, you throw away the second religious section, but keep the first. It's all there. It's all the secular data, which can make the case just as well. I mean, as believers, we want to hear what God may have to say about this as well, but we shouldn't be ashamed to say, hey, the secular data, you name it on anything, sexual activity outside of marriage, cohabitation, I mean, just name the issue. It is surprising how over and over again, if you have objective, neutral data out there, it actually sides with our point of view.
That's right.
The kind of things God may say about, sex before marriage, guess what? It's backed up by the social science research. So, we don't, on the one hand, be ashamed of, say, sharing biblical precepts and so on, but I'm often in a situation like this. I'm talking to a secular journalist. I'm talking in a secular debate. I can't throw scripture back at them. I have to simply deal with the medical scientific data. And by the way, simply go back to preceding Christianity. Apart from Judaism, consider the Hippocratic Oath, right? Certainly not Catholic, certainly not Christian, not even Jewish. But this long-standing medical ethic, the first principle of which is do no harm.
That's right.
Come on, this has been standard. You'd be taught it in med school and certainly in your ethics classes. Sadly, today, a lot of universities that are training doctors, nurses, and so on, if they still have medical ethics courses, they've been totally stripped of the Hippocratic Oath. They've been totally stripped of that whole heritage. So a lot of young people today growing up, studying to get into medicine and learn a bit about bioethics and so on, they may not even be exposed to those very core precepts that for a good 2,500 years kind of underlined how we do medicine, how we treat people, how we look at people. Both euthanasia and abortion were strongly condemned in the Hippocratic Oath, but as I say now, most people are probably not even aware that that has been there. So these claims that this is just religious argumentation and therefore can be dismissed, it's another one of those fallacies. It gets a good run with the media. They often don't bother doing their homework either. So it sounds good, but anybody who does do a little bit of study will see this is just a useless objection, and there's very good, sound cases to be made against euthanasia, abortion, surrogacy, and so on. So that's what we have to run with. We have to equip our own people, which is partly why I spend a lot of time writing books. we need to get this kind of information out there.
So let's deal with some of the alleged myths of the anti-euthanasia case. One of the claims is that it's a myth that there's a slippery slope, a valid slippery slope argument. The Victorian government had a committee to investigate the other jurisdictions in the world that have had euthanasia for a while. Their conclusion was that the data doesn't support the slippery slope argument. Tell me whether that's a myth or not. What does the data say that you've got?
Well, there's this famous old phrase, I think it goes back to Hobbes, right, about lies, damned lies, and statistics, and how we can play with facts and figures and use it for ideological reasons. And, well, even if you're not familiar with the Victorian report that you mentioned, there's very popular level people, right? Andrew Denton is a well-known Australian figure. Sadly had a bad experience with his own father passing away, so he's extrapolated from that, and he's basically got a whole career now as a pro-euthanasia advocate. And he's got, he's on TV, the ABC runs with him, he's got a whole film series on this, and yeah, sure, he says the same thing. I've looked into this carefully, there is no slippery slope, the safeguards in place are working just fine. Look, when you know even a bit about this kind of topic and you hear somebody like Andrew Denton saying this, well, look, either at best he's being woefully ignorant or, at worst, well, he's blatantly lying to the Australian people. I mean, this is simply not the case. We just look at the nations that have gone down this path already. Holland was one of the early nations. Belgium, we can look at American states, Oregon, Vermont. So, we've been there, we've done that. We have historical examples that we can look at. And they've all, by the way, had really great, strong, in theory, safeguards. They all said, look, hard cases only, extreme cases, it's not going to mushroom out. Everyone has said that. What's the reality? Well, let's go back to Holland. And by the way, I lived in Holland for 5 years, so maybe I can speak a bit to this. I think Andrew Denton visited Holland for, a few days. But aside from how long you may have lived there, since the early 90s, Holland has had legalized euthanasia. And very early on, over 20 years ago, for example, there was a very famous official government report called the Remelink Report. Now, for Andrew to go on, and he spent quite a bit of time in his tapes talking about this, did he mention the Remelink Report? Would you even know such a thing as the Remelink Report existed? No. Denton very selectively ran with the facts that he wanted to run with, and he simply overlooked tons of others, such as the Remelink Report, which again, even 20 years ago was saying, on average, over 1,000 people a year in Holland were being euthanized against their will, without their consent.
Wow.
Over 1,000 every year, and that was 20 years ago. And, well, since then, Belgium has gone down the same path. And by the way, it's worse now in Belgium. More people are being knocked off in Belgium without their consent. In fact, one recent study found 32% of all euthanasia deaths in Belgium, people say, I'm not asking for this. In fact, it's interesting, before Belgium went down this line, I knew of plenty of Dutch elderly people who were leaving Holland, crossing the border into Belgium because they didn't want to be prematurely knocked off.
Wow.
They had too many horror stories of friends being bumped off for various reasons against their will. So a lot of them were moving away from Holland to Belgium. Well, now they picked the wrong country because Belgium has followed the same path. So look, if you simply have any kind of objective look at the data of what's happened for the last 20 or 30 years, the kind of claims being made by people like Andrew Denton, they do not stand up whatsoever.